storytelling. I still do. It's why I love Selected Shorts. So when Selected Shorts asked me to thank their sponsor, Zabars and Zabars.com, I said happy to. Zabars and Zabars.com sell over 8,000 pounds of freshly roasted coffee each week and also have New York toasting bagels, smoked salmon, caviar, and babka. And Zabars delivers throughout the 50 states, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Listeners can find out about exclusive offers and free shipping and can get a free story download at zabars.com/shorts.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the easiest way to create a beautiful website, blog, or online store for you and your ideas. Squarespace features an elegant interface, beautiful templates, and incredible 24/7 customer support. Try Squarespace at squarespace.com and enter the offer code SHORTS at checkout to get 10% off. Squarespace. Build it beautiful. Welcome to a special podcast-only edition of Selected Shorts. One of the joys of working with actors is discovering when they love and are excited by an author. For example, when we asked Stephen Colbert if he'd like to take part in our night devoted to the Southern Gothic writer Flannery O'Connor, not only did he respond immediately to say he would, he also asked if he could read her story, The Enduring Chill. What do you say when the new host of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert asks if he can read a story? You say yes. Yes, you can. A quick note. Because this story is longer than 55 minutes, we are unable to use it for our radio show, which is why this performance is only available as a Selected Shorts podcast, where we don't have to adhere to a broadcast clock. We hope you'll enjoy Stephen Colbert's performance as much as we did. Let us know what you think on our Facebook page or at Selected Shorts on Twitter.
Asbury's train stopped so that he would get off exactly where his mother was standing, waiting to meet him. Her thin, spectacled face below him was bright with a wide smile that disappeared as she caught sight of him, bracing himself behind the conductor. The smile vanished so suddenly, the shocked look that replaced it was so complete, that he realized for the first time that he must look as ill as he was. The sky was a chill gray, and a startling white gold sun, like some strange potentate from the east, was rising beyond the black woods that surrounded Timberborough. It cast a strange light over the single block of one-story brick and wooden shacks. Asbury felt that he was about to witness a majestic transformation, that the flat of roofs might at any moment turn into the mounting turrets of some exotic temple for a god he didn't know. The illusion lasted only a moment before his attention was drawn back to his mother. She had given a little cry. She looked aghast. He was pleased that she should see death in his face at once. His mother, at the age of 60, was going to be introduced to reality, and he supposed that if the experience didn't kill her, it would assist her in the process of growing up. He stepped down and greeted her. "You don't look very well," she said, and gave him a long clinical stare. "I don't feel like talking," he said at once. "I've had a bad trip." Mrs. Fox observed that his left eye was bloodshot. He was puffy and pale, and his hair had receded tragically for a boy of 25. The thin reddish wedge of it, left on top, bore down in a point that seemed to lengthen his nose and give him an irritable expression that matched the tone of his voice when he spoke to her. "It must have been cold up there," she said. "Why don't you take off your coat? It's not cold down here." "You don't have to tell me what the temperature is," he said in a high voice. "I'm old enough to know when I want to take my coat off." The train glided silently away behind him, leaving a view of the twin blocks of dilapidated stores. He gazed after the aluminum speck disappearing into the woods. It seemed to him that his last connection with the larger world were vanishing forever. Then he turned and faced his mother grimly, irked that he had allowed himself, even for an instant, to see an imaginary temple in this collapsing country junction. He had become entirely accustomed to the thought of death, but he had not become accustomed to the thought of death here. He had felt the end coming for nearly 4 months. Alone in his freezing flat, huddled under his 2 blankets and his overcoat with the 3 thicknesses of the New York Times between. He had had a chill one night, followed by a violent sweat that had left the sheets soaking and removed all doubt from his mind about his true condition. Before this, there had been a gradual slackening of his energy and vague, inconsistent aches and headaches. He had been absent so many days from his part-time job in the bookstore that he had lost it. Since then, he had been living, or just barely so, on his savings, and these, diminishing day by day, had been all he had between him and home. Now there was nothing. He was here. "Where's the car?" he muttered. "It's over yonder," his mother said, "and your sister is asleep in the back, because I don't like to come out this early by myself. There is no need to wake her up." "No," he said. "Let sleeping dogs lie." And he picked up his 2 bulging suitcases and started across the road with them. They were too heavy for him, and by the time he reached the car, his mother saw that he was exhausted. He had never come home with 2 suitcases before. Ever since he had first gone away to college, he had come back every time with nothing but the necessities for a 2-week stay, and with a wooden, resigned expression that said he was prepared to endure the visit for exactly 14 days. "You've brought more than usual," she observed. But he did not answer. He opened the car door and hoisted the 2 bags in beside his sister's upturned feet, giving first the feet in Girl Scout shoes, and then the rest of her a revolted look of recognition. She was packed into a black suit and had a white rag around her head with metal curlers sticking out from under the edges. Her eyes were closed and her mouth open. He and she had the same features, except hers were bigger. She was 8 years older than he was and was the principal of the county elementary school. He shut the door softly so she wouldn't wake up, and then went around and got in the front seat and closed his eyes. His mother backed the car into the road, and in a few minutes he felt it swerve into the highway. Then he opened his eyes. The road stretched between 2 open fields of yellow bitterweed. "Do you think Timberboro has improved?" his mother asked. This was her standard question, meant to be taken literally. "It's still there, isn't it?" he said in an ugly voice. "2 of the stores have new fronts," she said. Then with sudden ferocity, she said, "You did well to come home where you can get a good doctor. I'll take you to Dr. Block this afternoon." "I am not," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "Going to Dr. Block this afternoon or ever. Don't you think if I'd wanted to go to a doctor, I'd have gone up there where they have some good ones? Don't you know they have better doctors in New York? He would take a personal interest in you," she said. "None of those doctors up there would take a personal interest in you." "I don't want him taking a personal interest in me." Then after a minute, staring out across a blurred, purple-looking field, he said, "What's wrong with me is way beyond Block." And his voice trailed off into a frayed sound, almost a sob. He could not, as his friend Getz had recommended, prepare to see it all as an illusion, either what had gone before or the few weeks that were left to him. Getz was certain that death was nothing at all. Getz, whose whole face had always been purple splotched with a million indignations, had returned from 6 months in Japan as dirty as ever, but as bland as the Buddha himself. Getz took the news of Asbury's approaching end with a calm indifference. Quoting something or other, he said, "Although the Bodhisattva leads an infinite number of creatures into nirvana, in reality there are neither any Bodhisattvas to do the leading, nor any creatures to be led." However, out of some feeling for his welfare, Getz had put forth $4.50 to take him to a lecture on Vedanta. It had been a waste of his money. While Getz had listened enthralled to the dark little man on the platform, Asbury's bored gaze had roved among the audience. It had passed over the heads of several girls in saris, past a Japanese youth, a blue-black man with a fez, and several girls who looked like secretaries. Finally, at the end of the row, it had rested on a lean, spectacled figure in black, a priest. The priest's expression was of a polite but strictly reserved interest. Asbury identified his own feelings immediately in the taciturn, superior expression. When the lecture was over, a few students met in Getz's flat, the priest among them, but he was equally reserved. He listened with a marked politeness to the discussion of Asbury approaching death, but he said little. A little girl in a sari remarked that self-fulfillment was out of the question since it meant salvation, and the word was meaningless. Salvation, quoted Getz, is the destruction of a simple prejudice, and no one is saved. And what do you say to that? Asbury asked the priest and returned his reserved smile over the heads of the others. The borders of this smile seemed to touch on some icy clarity. There is, the priest said, a real probability of the new man, assisted, of course, he added brittly, by the third person of the Trinity. Ridiculous, the girl in the sari said, but the priest only brushed her with his smile, which was slightly amused now. When he got up to leave, he silently handed Asbury a small card on which he had written his name, Ignatius Vogel, S.J., and an address. Perhaps, Asbury thought now, he should have used it, for the priest appealed to him as a man of the world, someone who would have understood the unique tragedy of his death, a death whose meaning had been far beyond the twittering group around them, and how much more beyond Bloch. What's wrong with me, he repeated, is way beyond Bloch. His mother knew at once what he meant. He meant he was going to have a nervous breakdown. She did not say a word. She did not say that this was precisely what she could have told him would happen. When people think they are smart, even when they are smart, there is nothing anybody can say to make them see things straight. And with Asbury, the trouble was that in addition to being smart, he had an artistic temperament. She did not know where he had got it from because his father, who was a lawyer and businessman and farmer and politician all rolled into one, had certainly had his feet on the ground, and she had certainly always had hers on it. She had managed after he died to get the two of them through college and beyond, but she had observed that the more education they got, the less that they could do. Their father had gone to a one-room schoolhouse through the 8th grade, and he could do anything. She could have told Asbury what would help him. She could have said, if you would get out in the sunshine, or if you would work for a month in the dairy, you'd be a different person. But she knew exactly how that suggestion would be received. He would be a nuisance in the dairy, but she would let him work in there if he wanted to. She had let him work in there last year when he had come home and was writing the play. He had been writing a play about Negroes. Why anybody would want to write a play about Negroes was beyond her. And he had said he wanted to work in the dairy with them to find out what their interests were. Their interests were in doing as little as they could get by with, as she could have told him, if anybody could have told him anything. The Negroes had put up with him, and he had learned to put the milkers on, and once he had washed all the cans, and she thought that once he had mixed the feed, then a cow had kicked him, and he had not gone back into the barn again. She knew that if he would get in there now or just get out and fix fences or do any kind of work, real work, not writing, that he might avoid this nervous breakdown. Whatever happened to that play you were writing about the Negroes? She asked. I'm not writing plays, he said. And get this through your head. I am not working in any dairy. I am not getting out in the sunshine. I am ill. I have fever and chills, and I'm dizzy, and all I want you to do is to leave me alone. Then if you are really ill, you should see Dr. Bloch. I am not seeing Bloch, he finished, and ground himself down in the seat and stared intensely in front of him. She turned into their driveway, a red road that ran for a quarter of a mile through the two front pastures. The dry cows were on one side and the milk herd on the other. She slowed the car and then stopped altogether, her attention caught by a cow with a bad quarter. They haven't been attending to her, she said. Look at that bag. Asbury turned his head abruptly in the opposite direction, but there, a small, wall-eyed Guernsey was watching him steadily, as if she sensed some bond between them. Good God, he cried in an agonized voice. Can't we go on? It's 6 o'clock in the morning. Yes, yes, his mother said, and started the car quickly. What's that cry of deadly pain? His sister drawled from the back seat. Oh, it's you. She said, well, well, we have the artist with us again. How utterly, utterly. She had a decidedly nasal voice. He didn't answer her or turn his head. He had learned that much. Never answer her. Mary George, his mother said sharply, Asbury is sick. Leave him alone. What's wrong with him? Mary George asked. There's the house, his mother said, as if they were all blind but her. It rose on the crest of the hill, a white two-story farmhouse with a wide porch and pleasant columns. She always approached it with a feeling of pride. And she had said more than once to Asbury, you have a home here that half of those people up there would give their eye teeth for. She had been once to the terrible place he lived in New York. They had gone up 5 flights of dark stone steps, past open garbage cans on every landing to arrive finally at 2 damp rooms and a closet with a toilet in it. You wouldn't live like this at home? She had muttered. No, he'd said with an ecstatic look. It wouldn't be possible. She supposed the truth was that she simply didn't understand how it felt to be sensitive or how peculiar you were when you were an artist. His sister said he was not an artist and that he had no talent and that was the trouble with him. But Mary George was not a happy girl herself. Asbury said she posed as an intellectual, but that her IQ couldn't be over 75, and that all she really was interested in was getting a man, but that no sensible man would finish a first look at her. She had tried to tell him that Mary George could be very attractive when she put her mind to it, and he had said that such a strain on her mind would break her down. If she were in any way attractive, he had said, she wouldn't now be the principal of a county elementary school, and Mary George had said that if Asbury had had any talent, he would now have published something. What had he ever published, she wanted to know, and for that matter, what had he ever written? Mrs. Fox had pointed out that he was only 25 years old. And Mary George had said that the age that most people publish something was at 21, which made him exactly 4 years overdue. Mrs. Fox was not up on things like that, but she suggested that he might be writing a very long book. Very long book, her eye, Mary George said. He would do well if he came up with so much as a poem. Mrs. Fox hoped it wasn't going to be just a poem. She pulled the car into the side drive, and a scattering of guineas exploded into the air and sailed screaming around the house. Home again, jiggity jig, she said. Oh, God, Asbury groaned. The artist arrives at the gas chamber, Mary George said in her nasal voice. He leaned on the door and got out, and forgetting his bags, he moved toward the front of the house as if he were in a daze. His sister got out and stood by the car door, squinting at his bent, unsteady figure. As she watched him go up the front steps, her mouth fell slack in her astonished face. Why? She said. There is something the matter with him. He looks 100 years old. Didn't I tell you so? Her mother hissed. Now you keep your mouth shut, and you let him alone. He went into the house, pausing in the hall only long enough to see his pale, broken face glare at him for an instant from the pier mirror. Holding on to the banister, he pulled himself up the steep steps across the landing, and then up the shorter second flight and into his room, a large, open, airy room with a faded blue rug and white curtains freshly put up for his arrival. He looked at nothing, but fell face down on his own bed. It was a narrow antique bed with a high ornamental headboard on which was carved a garland basket overflowing with wooden fruit. While he was still in New York, he had written a letter to his mother which filled 2 notebooks. He did not mean it to be read until after his death. It was such a letter as Kafka had addressed to his father. Asbury's father had died 20 years ago, and Asbury considered it a great blessing. The old man, he felt sure, had been one of the courthouse gang, a rural worthy with a dirty finger in every pie, and he knew he would not have been able to stomach him. He had read some of his correspondence and had been appalled by its stupidity. He knew, of course, that his mother would not understand the letter at once. Her literal mind would require some time to discover the significance of it. But he thought she would be able to see that he forgave her for all she had done to him. For that matter, he supposed that she would realize what she had done to him only through the letter. He didn't think she was conscious of it at all. Her self-satisfaction itself was barely conscious. But because of the letter, she might experience a painful realization, and this would be the only thing of value he had to leave her. If reading it would be painful to her, writing it had sometimes been unbearable to him. For in order to face her, he had had to face himself. I came here to escape the slave's atmosphere of home, he had written, to find freedom, to liberate my imagination, to take it like a hawk from its cage and set it whirling off into the widening gyre. Yeats. And what did I find? It was incapable of flight. It was some bird you had domesticated sitting huffy in its pen, refusing to come out. The next words were underscored twice. I have no imagination. I have no talent. I can't create. I have nothing but the desire for these things. Why didn't you kill that too? Woman, why did you pinion me? Writing this, he had reached the pit of despair. And he thought that reading it, she would at least begin to sense his tragedy and her part in it. It was not that she had ever forced her way on him. That had never been necessary. Her way had simply been the air he breathed. And when at last he had found other air, he couldn't survive in it. He felt that even if she didn't understand it once, the letter would leave her with an enduring chill, and perhaps in time lead her to see herself as she was. He had destroyed everything else he had ever written, his 2 lifeless novels, his half-dozen stationary plays, his prosy poems, his sketchy short stories, and kept only the 2 notebooks that contained the letter. They were in the black suitcase that his sister, huffing and blowing, was now dragging up the 2nd flight of stairs. His mother was carrying the smaller bag and came on ahead. He turned over as she entered the room. "I'll open this and get out your things," she said, "and you can go right to bed, and in a few minutes I'll bring up your breakfast." He sat up and said in a fretful voice, "I don't want any breakfast. And I can open my own suitcase. Leave that alone." His sister arrived in the door, her face full of curiosity, and let the black bag fall with a thud over the doorsill. Then she began to push it across the room with her foot until she was close enough to get a good look at him. "If I looked as bad as you do," she said, "I'd go to the hospital." Her mother cut her eyes sharply at her, and then she left. Then Mrs. Fox closed the door and came to the bed and sat down on it beside him. "Now this time, I want you to make a long visit and rest," she said. "This visit," he said, "will be permanent." "Wonderful," she cried. "You can have a little studio in your room, and in the mornings you can write plays, and in the afternoons you can help in the dairy." He turned a white wooden face to her. "Close the blinds and let me sleep," he said. When she was gone, he lay for some time staring at the water stains on the gray walls. Descending from the top molding, long icicle shapes had been etched by leaks, and directly over his bed on the ceiling, another leak had made a fierce bird with spread wings. It had an icicle crosswise in its beak, and there were smaller icicles depending from its wings and tail. It had been there since his childhood, and it always irritated him, and sometimes it frightened him. He had often had the illusion that it was in motion and about to descend mysteriously and set the icicle on his head. He closed his eyes and thought, "I won't have to look at it for many more days." And presently he went to sleep. When he woke up in the afternoon, there was a pink, open-mouthed face hanging over him, and from 2 large, familiar ears on either side of it, the black tubes of Bloch's stethoscope extended down to his exposed chest. The doctor, seeing he was awake, made a face like a Chinaman, rolled his eyes almost out of his head, and cried, "Say ah!" Bloch was irresistible to children. For miles around, they vomited and went into fevers to have a visit from him. Mrs. Fox was standing behind him, smiling radiantly. "Here's Dr. Bloch," she said, as if she had captured this angel on the rooftop and brought it in for her little boy. "Get him out of here," Asbury muttered. He looked at the asinine face from what seemed like the bottom of a black hole. The doctor peered closer, wiggling his ears. Bloch was bald and had a round face as senseless as a baby's. Nothing about him indicated intelligence except 2 cold, nickel-colored eyes that hung with a motionless curiosity over whatever he looked at. "You sure do look bad, Asbury," he murmured. He took the stethoscope off and dropped it in his bag. "I don't know when I seen anybody your age look as sorry as you do. What you been doing to yourself?" There was a continuous thud in the back of Asbury's head, as if his heart had got trapped in it and was fighting to get out. "I didn't send for you," he said. Block put his hand on the glaring face and pulled the eyelid down and peered into it. "You must have been on the bum up there," he said. He began to press his hand in the small of Asbury's back. "I went up there once myself," he said, "and saw exactly how little they had and came straight on back home. Open your mouth." Asbury opened it automatically, and the drill-like gaze swung over it and bore down. He snapped it shut, and in a wheezing, breathless voice he said, "If I'd wanted a doctor, I'd have stayed up there where I could have got a good one." "Asbury," his mother said. "How long you been having that sore throat?" Block asked. "She sent for you," Asbury said. "She can answer the questions." "Asbury," his mother said. Block leaned over his bag and pulled out a rubber tube. He pushed Asbury's sleeve up and tied the tube around his upper arm. Then he took out a syringe and prepared to find the vein, humming a hymn as he pressed the needle in. Asbury lay with a rigid, outraged stare while the privacy of his blood was invaded by this idiot. "Slowly, Lord, but sure," Block sang in a murmuring voice. "Oh, slowly, Lord, but sure." When the syringe was full, he withdrew the needle. "Blood don't lie," he said. He poured it in a bottle, stopped it up, and put the bottle in his bag. "Asbury," he started. "How long?" Asbury sat up and thrust his thudding head forward and said, "I didn't send for you. I'm not answering any questions. You're not my doctor. What's wrong with me is way beyond you." "Most things are beyond me," Block said. "I ain't found nothing yet I thoroughly understood." He sighed and got up. His eyes seemed to glitter at Asbury as if from a great distance. "He wouldn't act so ugly," Mrs. Fox explained, "if he weren't really sick, and I want you to come back every day until you get him well." Asbury's eyes were a fierce, glaring, violent. "What's wrong with me is way beyond you," he repeated, and lay back down and closed his eyes until Block and his mother were gone. In the next few days, though he grew rapidly worse, his mind functioned with a terrible clarity. On the point of death, he found himself existing in a state of illumination that was totally out of keeping with the kind of talk he had to listen to from his mother. This was largely about cows, with names like Daisy and Bessie Button, and their intimate functions, their mastitis and their screwworms and their abortions. His mother insisted that in the middle of the day he get out and sit on the porch and enjoy the view. And as resistance was too much of a struggle, he dragged himself out and sat there in a rigid slouch, his feet wrapped in an afghan and his hands gripped on the chair arms, as if he were about to spring forward into the glaring china blue sky. The lawn extended for a quarter of an acre down to a barbed wire fence that divided it from the front pasture. In the middle of the day, the dry cows rested there under a line of sweet gum trees. On the other side of the road were two hills with a pond between, and his mother could sit on the porch and watch the herd walk across the dam to the hill on the other side. The whole scene was rimmed by a wall of trees, which, at the time of day he was forced to sit there, was a washed-out blue that reminded him sadly of the Negro's faded overalls. He listened irritably while his mother detailed the faults of the help. "Those two are not stupid," she said. "They know how to look out for themselves." "They need to," he muttered. But there was no use arguing with her. Last year, he had been writing a play about the Negro, and he had wanted to be around them for a while to see how they really felt about their condition, but the two who worked for her had lost all their initiative over the years. They didn't talk. The one called Morgan was light brown, part Indian. The other, older one, Randall, was very black and fat. When they said anything to him, it was as if they were speaking to an invisible body located to the right or left of where he actually was. And after 2 days of working side by side with them, he felt he had not established rapport. So he decided to try something bolder than talk. And one afternoon, as he was standing near Randall, watching him adjust a milker, he had quietly taken out his cigarettes and lit one. The Negro had stopped what he was doing and watched him. He waited until Asbury had taken 2 draws, and then he said, "She don't allow no smoking in here." The other one approached and stood there grinning. "I know it," Asbury said. And after a deliberate pause, he shook the package and held it out, first to Randall, who took one, and then to Morgan, who took one. He had then lit the cigarettes for them himself, and the 3 of them had stood there smoking. There were no sounds but the steady click of the two milking machines and the occasional slap of a cow's tail against her side. It was one of those moments of communion when the difference between black and white is absorbed into nothing. The next day, 2 cans of milk had been returned from the creamery because it had absorbed the odor of tobacco. He took the blame and told his mother that it was he and not the Negroes who had been smoking. "If you were doing it, they were doing it," she had said. "Don't you think I know those two?" She was incapable of thinking them innocent, but the experience had so exhilarated him that he had been determined to repeat it in some other way. The next afternoon, when he and Randall were in the milk house pouring the fresh milk into the cans, he had picked up the jelly glass the Negroes drank out of and, inspired, had poured himself a glassful of the warm milk and drained it down. Randall had stopped pouring and had remained half bent over the can, watching him. "She don't allow that," he said. "That the thing she don't allow." Asbury poured out another glassful and handed it to him. "She don't allow it," he repeated. "Listen," Asbury said hoarsely. "The world is changing. There's no reason I shouldn't drink after you or you after me. She don't allow none of us to drink none of this here milk," Randall said. Asbury continued to hold the glass out to him. "You took the cigarette," he said. "Take the milk. It's not going to hurt my mother to lose 2 or 3 glasses of milk a day. We've got to think free if we want to live free." The other one had come up and was standing in the door. "Don't want none of that milk," Randall said. Asbury swung around and held the glass out to Morgan. "Here, boy, have a drink of this," he said. Morgan stared at him. Then his face took on a decided look of cunning. "I ain't seen you drink none of it yourself," he said. Asbury despised milk. The first warm glassful had turned his stomach. He drank half of what he was holding and handed the rest to the Negro, who took it and gazed down inside the glass as if it contained some great mystery. Then he set it on the floor by the cooler. "Don't you like milk?" Asbury asked. "I likes it, but I ain't drinking none of that." "Why?" "She don't allow it," Morgan said. "My God!" Asbury exploded. She. He had tried the same thing the next day and the next and the next, but he could not get them to drink the milk. A few afternoons later, when he was standing outside the milk house about to go in, he heard Morgan ask, "How come you let him drink that milk every day?" "What he do is him," Randall said. "What I do is me." "How come he talks so ugly about his ma? She ain't whop him enough when he was little," Randall said. The insufferableness of life at home had overcome him, and he had returned to New York 2 days early. So far as he was concerned, he had died there, and the question now was how long he could stand to linger here. He could have hastened this end by suicide, but would not have been a victory. Death was coming to him legitimately, as a justification, as a gift from life. That was his greatest triumph. Then, too, to the fine minds of the neighborhood, a suicide son would indicate a mother who had been a failure, and while this was the case, he felt that it was a public embarrassment he could spare her. What she would learn from the letter would be a private revelation. He had sealed the notebooks in a manila envelope and had written on it, "To be opened only after the death of Asbury Porter Fox." He had put the envelope in the desk drawer in his room and locked it, and the key was in his pajama pocket until he could decide on a place to leave it. When he sat on the porch in the morning, his mother felt that some of the time she should talk about subjects that were of interest to him. The third morning, she started in on his writing. "When you get well," she said, "I think it would be nice if you wrote a book about down here. We need another good book like Gone with the Wind." He could feel the muscles in his stomach begin to tighten. "Put the war in it," she advised. "That always makes a long book." He put his head back gently, as if he were afraid it would crack. After a moment, he said, "I am not going to write any book." "Well," she said, if you don't feel like writing a book, you could just write poems. They're nice." She realized what he needed was someone intellectual to talk to, but Mary George was the only intellectual she knew, and he would not talk to her. He had thought of Mr. Bush, the retired Methodist minister, but she had not brought this up. Now she decided to hazard it. "I think I'll call Dr. Bush to come to see you," she said, raising Mr. Bush's rank. "You'd enjoy him. He collects rare coins." She was not prepared for the reaction she got. He began to shake all over and give loud, spasmodic laughs. He seemed about to choke. After a minute, he subsided into a cough. "If you think I need spiritual aid to die," he said, "you're quite mistaken, and certainly not from that ass Bush. My God." "I didn't mean that at all," she said. "He has coins dating from the time of Cleopatra." "Well, if you ask him here, I'll tell him to go to hell," he said. "Bush, that beats all." "I'm glad something amuses you," she said acidly. For a time, they sat there in silence. Then his mother looked up. He was sitting forward again and smiling at her. His face was brightening more and more, as if he had just had an idea that was brilliant. She stared at him. "I'll tell you who I want to come," he said. And for the first time since he had come home, his expression was pleasant, though there was also, she thought, a kind of crafty look about him. "Who do you want to come?" she asked suspiciously. "I want a priest," he announced. "A priest?" his mother said in an uncomprehending voice. "Preferably a Jesuit," he said, brightening more and more. "Yes, by all means a Jesuit. They have them in the city. You can call up and get me one." "What is the matter with you?" his mother asked. "Most of them are very well educated," he said, "but Jesuits are foolproof. A Jesuit would be able to discuss something besides the weather." Already, remembering Ignatius Vogel, S.J., he could picture the priest. This one would be a trifle more worldly, perhaps, a trifle more cynical. Protected by their ancient institution, priests could afford to be cynical, play both ends against the middle. He would talk to a man of culture before he died, even in this desert. Furthermore, nothing would irritate his mother so much. He could not understand why he had not thought of this sooner. "You're not a member of that church," Mrs. Fox said shortly. "It's 20 miles away. They wouldn't send one." She hoped that this would end the matter. He sat back absorbed in the idea, determined to force her to make the call, since she always did what he wanted if he kept at her. "I'm dying," he said. "And I haven't asked you to do but one thing, and you refuse me that." "You are not dying." "When you realize it," he said, "it'll be too late." There was another unpleasant silence. Presently, his mother said, "Nowadays, doctors don't let young people die. They give them some of these new medicines." She began shaking her foot with a nerve-rattling assurance. "People just don't die like they used to," she said. "Mother," he said, "you ought to be prepared. I think even Block knows and hasn't told you yet." Block, after the first visit, had come in grimly every time, without his jokes and funny faces, and had taken his blood in silence, his nickel-colored eyes unfriendly. He was, by definition, the enemy of death, and he looked now as if he was battling the real thing. He said that he wouldn't prescribe until he knew what was wrong, and Asbury had laughed in his face. "Mother," he said, "I am going to die." He tried to make each word like a hammer blow on top of her head. She paled slightly, but she did not blink. "Do you think for 1 minute," she said angrily, "that I intend to sit here and let you die?" Her eyes were as hard as two old mountain ranges seen in the distance. He felt the first distinct stroke of doubt. "Do you?" she asked fiercely. "I don't think you have anything to do with it," he said in a shaken voice. "Humph," she said, got up and left the porch as if she could not stand to be around such stupidity an instant longer. Forgetting the Jesuit, he went rapidly over his symptoms. His fever had increased. Interspersed by chills, he barely had the energy to drag himself out on the porch. Food was abhorrent to him, and Block had not been able to give her the least satisfaction. Even as he sat there, he felt the beginning of a new chill, as if death were already playfully rattling his bones. He pulled the Afghan off his feet and put it around his shoulders and made his way unsteadily up the stairs to bed. He continued to grow worse. In the next few days, he became so much weaker and badgered her so constantly about the Jesuit that finally, in desperation, she decided to humor his foolishness. She made the call, explaining in a chilly voice that her son was ill, perhaps a little out of his head, and wished to speak to a priest. While she made the call, Asbury hung over the banisters barefooted with the Afghan around him and listened. When she hung up, he called down to know when the priest was coming. "Tomorrow sometime," his mother had said irritably. He could tell by the fact that she had made the call that her assurance was beginning to shatter. Whenever she let Block in or out, there was much whispering in the downstairs hall. That evening, he heard her and Mary George talking in low voices in the parlor. He thought he heard his name, and he got up and tiptoed into the hall and down the first 3 steps until he could hear the voices distinctly. "I had to call that priest," his mother was saying. "I'm afraid this is serious. I thought it was just a nervous breakdown, but now I think it's something real. Dr. Block thinks it's something real, too, and whatever it is worse because he's so run down." "Grow up, Mama," Mary George said. "I've told you, and I'll tell you again, what's wrong with him is purely psychosomatic." There was nothing she was not an expert on. "No," his mother said. "It's a real disease. The doctor says so." He thought he detected a crack in her voice. "Block is an idiot," Mary George said. "You've got to face the facts. Asbury can't write, so he gets sick. He's going to be an invalid instead of an artist. Do you know what he needs?" "No," his mother said. 2 or 3 shock treatments," Mary George said. "Get that artist business out of his head once and for all." His mother gave a little cry, and he grasped the banister. "Mark my words," his sister continued, "all he's going to be around here for the next 50 years is a decoration." He went back to bed. In a sense, she was right. He had failed his god, art, but he had been faithful servant, and art was sending him death. He had seen this from the first with a kind of mystical clarity. He went to sleep thinking of the peaceful spot and the family burying ground where he would soon lie, and after a while he saw that his body was being borne slowly toward it while his mother and Mary George watched without interest from their chairs on the porch. As the bier was carried across the dam, they could look up and see the procession reflected upside down in the pond. A lean, dark figure in a Roman collar followed it. He had a mysteriously saturnine face in which there was a subtle blend of asceticism and corruption. Asbury was laid in a shallow grave on the hillside, and the indistinct mourners, after standing in silence for a while, spread out over the darkening green. The Jesuit retired to a spot beneath a dead tree to smoke and meditate. The moon came up, and Asbury was aware of a presence bending over him and a gentle warmth on his cold face. He knew that this was art come to wake him, and he sat up and opened his eyes. Across the hill, all the lights were on in his mother's house. The black pond was speckled with little nickel-colored stars. The Jesuit had disappeared. All around him, the cows were spread out grazing in the moonlight, and one large white one, violently spotted, was softly licking his head as if it were a block of salt. He awoke with a shudder and discovered that his bed was soaking from a night sweat. And as he sat shivering in the dark, he realized that the end was not many days distant. He gazed down into the crater of death and fell back dizzy on his pillow. The next day, his mother noted something almost ethereal about his ravaged face. He looked like one of those dying children who must have Christmas early. He sat up in the bed and directed the rearrangement of several chairs and had her remove a picture of a maiden chained to a rock, for he knew it would make the Jesuit smile. He had the uncomfortable rocker taken away, and when he finished, the room with its severe wall stains had a certain cell-like quality. He felt it would be attractive to the visitor. All morning he waited, looking irritably up at the ceiling where the bird with the icicle in its beak seemed poised and waiting too. But the priest did not arrive until late in the afternoon. As soon as his mother opened the door, a loud, unintelligible voice began to boom in the downstairs hall. Asbury's heart beat wildly. In a second, there was a heavy creaking on the stairs. Then, almost at once, his mother, her expression constrained, came in, followed by a massive old man who plowed straight across the room, picked up a chair by the side of the bed, and put it under himself. "I'm Father Finn from Purgatory," he said in a hearty voice. He had a large red face, a stiff brush of gray hair, and was blind in one eye, but the good eye, blue and clear, was focused sharply on Asbury. There was a grease spot on his vest. "So you want to talk to a priest," he said. "Very wise. None of us knows the hour our blessed Lord may call us." Then he cocked his good eye up at Asbury's mother and said, "Thank you, you may leave us now." Mrs. Fox stiffened and did not budge. "I'd like to talk to Father Finn alone," Asbury said. feeling suddenly that here he had an ally, although he had not expected a priest like this one. His mother gave him a disgusted look and left the room. He knew she would go no farther than just outside the door. "It's so nice of you to come," Asbury said. "This place is incredibly dreary. There's no one here an intelligent person can talk to. I wonder what you think of Joyce, Father." The priest lifted his chair and pushed closer. "You'll have to shout," he said, "blind in one eye and deaf in one ear." "What do you think of Joyce?" Asbury said louder. "Joyce? Joyce who?" asked the priest. "James Joyce," Asbury said and laughed. The priest brushed his huge hand in the air as if he were bothered by gnats. "I haven't met him," he said. "Now, do you say your morning and night prayers?" Asbury appeared confused. "Joyce was a great writer," he murmured, forgetting to shout. "You don't, eh?" said the priest. "Well, you will never learn to be good unless you pray regularly. You cannot love Jesus unless you speak to him. The myth of the dying God has always fascinated me," Asbury shouted, but the priest did not appear to catch it. "Do you have trouble with purity?" he demanded. And as Asbury paled, he went on without waiting for an answer. "We all do, but you must pray to the Holy Ghost for it. Mind, heart, and body. Nothing is overcome without prayer. Pray with your family." Do you pray with your family?" "God forbid," Asbury muttered. "My mother doesn't have time to pray, and my sister is an atheist," he shouted. "A shame," said the priest. "Then you must pray for them." "The artist prays by creating," Asbury ventured. "Not enough," snapped the priest. "If you do not pray daily, you are neglecting your immortal soul. Do you know your catechism?" "Certainly not," Asbury muttered. "Who made you?" the priest asked in a martial tone. "Well, different people believe different things about that," Asbury said. "God made you," the priest said shortly. "Who is God?" "God is an idea created by man," Asbury said, feeling that he was getting into the stride. That two could play at this. "God is a spirit infinitely perfect," the priest said. "You are a very ignorant boy. Why did God make you?" "God didn't. God made you to know him, to love him, to serve him in this world, and to be happy with him in the next," the old priest said in a battering voice. "If you don't apply yourself to the catechism, how do you expect to know how to save your immortal soul?" Asbury saw he had made a mistake, and it was time to get rid of the old fool. "Listen," he said, "I'm not a Roman." "A poor excuse for not saying your prayers," the old man snorted. Asbury slumped slightly in the bed. "I'm dying," he shouted. "But you're not dead yet," said the priest. "And how do you expect to meet God face to face when you've never spoken to him? How do you expect to get what you don't ask for? God does not send the Holy Ghost to those who don't ask for him. Ask him to send the Holy Ghost." "The Holy Ghost?" Asbury said. "Are you so ignorant you've never heard of the Holy Ghost?" the priest asked. "Certainly I've heard of the Holy Ghost," Asbury said furiously. "And the Holy Ghost is the last thing I'm looking for." "And he may be the last thing you get," the priest said. His one fierce eye inflamed. "Do you want your soul to suffer eternal damnation? Do you want to be deprived of God for all eternity? Do you want to suffer the most terrible pain, greater than fire, the pain of loss? Do you want to suffer the pain of loss for all eternity?" Asbury moved his arms and legs helplessly as if he were pinned to the bed by the terrible eye. "How can the Holy Ghost fill your soul when it's full of trash?" the priest roared. "The Holy Ghost will not come until you see yourself as you are, a lazy, ignorant, conceited youth," he said, pounding his fist on the bedside table. Mrs. Fox burst in. "Enough of this," she cried. "How dare you talk that way to a poor sick boy? You're upsetting him. You'll have to go." "The poor lad doesn't even know his catechism," the priest said, rising. "I should think you would have taught him to say his daily prayers. You have neglected your duty as a mother." I turned back to the bed and said affably, "I'll give you my blessing, and after this you must say your daily prayers without fail." Whereupon he put his hand on Asbury's head and mumbled something in Latin. "Call me any time," he said. "We can have another little chat." And then he followed Mrs. Fox rigid back out. The last thing Asbury heard him say was, "He's a good lad at heart, but very ignorant." When his mother got rid of the priest, she came rapidly up the steps again to say that she had told him so, but when she saw him, pale and drawn and ravaged, sitting up in his bed, staring in front of him with large, childish, shocked eyes, she did not have the heart and went rapidly out again. The next morning, he was so weak that she made up her mind he must go to the hospital. "I'm not going to any hospital," he kept repeating, turning his thudding head from side to side as if he wanted to work it loose from his body. "I'm not going to any hospital as long as I'm conscious." He was thinking bitterly that once he lost consciousness, she could drag him off to the hospital and fill him full of blood and prolong his misery for days. He was convinced that the end was approaching, that it would be today. And he was tormented now, thinking of his useless life. He felt as if he were a shell that had to be filled with something, but he did not know what. He began to take note of everything in the room as if for the last time: the ridiculous antique furniture, the pattern in the rug, the silly picture his mother had replaced. He even looked at the fierce bird with its icicle in its beak and felt that it was there for some purpose that he could not divine. There was something he was searching for, something that he felt he must have, some last significant culminating experience that he must make for himself before he died, make for himself out of his own intelligence. He had always relied on himself and had never been a sniveler after the ineffable. Once, when Mary George was 13 and he was 5, she had lured him with the promise of an unnamed president into a large tent full of people and had dragged him backwards up to the front where a man in a blue suit and a red and white tie was standing. "Here," she said in a loud voice, "I'm already saved, but you can save him. He's a real stinker and too big for his britches." He had broken her grip and shot out of there like a small cur, and later, when he had asked for his present, she had said, "You would have got salvation if you had waited for it, but since you acted the way you did, you get nothing." As the day wore on, he grew more and more frantic for fear he would die without making some last meaningful experience for himself. His mother sat anxiously by the side of the bed. She had called Block twice and could not get him. He thought even now she had not realized that he was going to die, much less that the end was only hours off. The light in the room was beginning to have an odd quality, almost as if it were taking on presence. In a darkened form, it entered and seemed to wait. Outside, it appeared to move no farther than the edge of a faded tree line, which he could see a few inches over the sill of his window. Suddenly, he thought of that experience of communion he had had in the dairy with the Negroes when they had smoked together, and once he began to tremble with excitement. They would smoke together one last time. After a moment, turning his head on the pillow, he said, "Mother, I want to tell the Negroes goodbye." His mother paled. For an instant, her face seemed about to fly apart. Then the line of her mouth hardened. Her brows drew together. "Goodbye?" she said in a flat voice. "Where are you going?" For a few seconds, he only looked at her. Then he said, "I think you know. Get them. I don't have long." "This is absurd," she muttered, but she got up and hurried out. He heard her try to reach Block again before she went out. He thought her clinging to Block at a time like this was touching and pathetic. He waited, preparing himself for the encounter as a religious man might prepare himself for the last sacrament. Presently, he heard their steps on the stair. "Here's Randall and Morgan," his mother said, ushering them in. "They've come to tell you hello." The two of them came in grinning and shuffled to the side of the bed. They stood there, Randall in front and Morgan behind. "You sure do look well," Randall said. "You looks very well." "You sure looks well," the other one said. "Yes, sir, you looks fine." "I ain't never seen you looking so well before," Randall said. "Yes, doesn't he look well," his mother said. "I think he looks just fine." "Yes, sir," Randall said. "I expect you ain't even sick." "Mother," Asbury said in a forced voice, "I'd like to talk to them alone." His mother stiffened. Then she marched out. She walked across the hall into the room on the other side and sat down. Through the open door, he could see her begin to rock in little short jerks. The two Negroes looked as if their last protection had dropped away. Asbury's head was so heavy he could not think what he was going to do. "I'm dying," he said. Both their grins became gelid. "You looks fine," Randall said. I'm going to die, Asbury repeated. Then, with relief, he remembered that they were going to smoke together. He reached for the package on the table and held it out to Randall, forgetting to shake out the cigarettes. The Negro took the package and put it in his pocket. Thank you, he said. I certainly do appreciate it. Asbury stared as if he had forgotten again. After a second, he became aware that the other Negro's face had turned infinitely sad. Then he realized it was not sad, but sullen. He fumbled in the drawer of the table and pulled out an unopened package and thrust it at Morgan. Thanks you, Mr. Asbury, Morgan said, brightening. You certainly does look well. I'm about to die, Asbury said irritably. You looks fine, Randall said. You'll be up and around in a few days, Morgan predicted. Neither of them seemed to find a suitable place to rest his gaze. Asbury looked wildly across the hall where his mother had her rocker turned so that her back faced him. It was apparent that she had no intention of getting rid of them for him. I expect you might have a little cold, Randall said after a time. I takes a little turpentine and sugar when I has a cold, Morgan said. Shut your mouth, Randall said, turning on him. Shut your own mouth, Morgan said. I knows what I takes. He don't take what you take, Randall growled. Mother, Asbury called in a shaking voice. His mother stood up. Mr. Asbury has had company long enough now, she called. You all can come back tomorrow. We be going, Randall said. You sure do look well. You sure does, Morgan said. They filed out agreeing with each other how well he looked. But Asbury's vision became blurred before they reached the hall. For an instant he saw his mother's form as if it were a shadow in the door, and then it disappeared after them down the stairs. He heard her call Block again, but he heard it without interest. His head was spinning. He knew now there would be no significant experience before he died. There was nothing more to do but give her the key to the drawer where the letter was and wait for the end. He sank into a heavy sleep from which he awoke at about 5 o'clock to see her white face very small at the end of a well of darkness. He took the key out of his pajama pocket and handed it to her and mumbled that there was a letter in the desk to be opened when he was gone. But she did not seem to understand. She put the key down on the bedside table and left it there, and he returned to his dream in which 2 large boulders were circling each other inside his head. He woke a little after 6 to hear Block's car stop below in the driveway. The sound was like a summons, bringing him rapidly and with a clear head out of his sleep. He had a sudden, terrible foreboding that the fate awaiting him was going to be more shattering than any he could have reckoned on. He lay absolutely motionless, still as an animal, the instant before an earthquake. Block and his mother talked as they came up the stairs, but he did not distinguish their words. The doctor came in making faces. His mother was smiling. "Guess what you've got, sugar pie?" she cried. Her voice broke in on him with the force of a gunshot. "Found that old bug, did old Block," Block said, sinking down into the chair by the bed. He raised his hands over his head in the gesture of a victorious prize fighter and then let them collapse in his lap as if the effort had exhausted him. Then he removed a red bandana handkerchief that he carried to be funny with and wiped his face thoroughly, having a different expression on it every time it appeared from behind the rag. "I think you're just as smart as you can be," Mrs. Fox said. "Asbury," she said, "you have undulant fever. It'll keep coming back, but it won't kill you." Her smile was as bright and intense as a light bulb without a shade. "I am so relieved," she said. Asbury sat up slowly, his face expressionless. Then he fell back down again. Block leaned over him and smiled. "You ain't gonna die," he said with deep satisfaction. Nothing about Asbury stirred except his eyes. They did not appear to move on the surface, but somewhere in their blurred depths there was an almost imperceptible motion as if something were struggling feebly. Block's gaze seemed to reach down like a steel pin and hold it, whatever it was, until the life was out of it. "Undulant fever ain't so bad, Asbury," he murmured. "It's the same thing as bangs in a cow." The boy gave a low moan and then was quiet. "He must have drunk some unpasteurized milk up there," his mother said softly. Then the two of them tiptoed out as if they thought he were about to go to sleep. When the sound of their footsteps had faded on the stairs, Asbury sat up again. He turned his head almost surreptitiously to the side where the key he had given his mother was lying on the bedside table. His hand shot out and closed over it and returned it to his pocket. He glanced across the room into the small oval-framed dresser mirror. The eyes that stared back at him were the same that had returned his gaze every day from that mirror, but it seemed to him that they were paler. They looked shocked clean, as if they had been prepared for some awful vision about to come down on him. He shuddered and turned his head quickly the other way and stared out the window. A blinding red-gold sun moved serenely from under a purple cloud. Below it, the tree line was black against the crimson sky. It formed a brittle wall, standing as if it were the frail defense he had set up in his mind to protect him from what was coming. The boy fell back on his pillow and stared at the ceiling. His limbs that had been racked for so many weeks by fever and chill were numb now. The old life in him was exhausted. He awaited the coming of new. It was then that he felt the beginning of a chill so peculiar, so light that it was like a warm ripple across a deeper sea of cold. His breath came short. The fierce bird, which through the years of his childhood and the days of his illness had been poised over his head, waiting mysteriously, appeared all at once to be in motion. Asbury blanched, and the last film of illusion was torn as if by a whirlwind from his eyes. He saw that for the rest of his days, frail, racked but enduring, he would live in the face of a purifying terror. A feeble cry, a last impossible protest escaped him. But the Holy Ghost, emblazoned in ice instead of fire, continued, implacable, to descend.
Selected Shorts is produced by Catherine Minton and Jennifer Brennan. Our radio producer is Sarah Montague. The readings are recorded by Miles B. Smith, and our mix engineer is Chase Culpon. Support for Selected Shorts is provided by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, publishers of the Best American Short Stories, edited in 2015 by T.C. Boyle. Additional support is provided by the Dunnigan Foundation, sponsor of the Ray Awards for the short story, the Hyles Nias Foundation, the Howard Gilman Foundation, Seedlings Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Zabars.com is a proud sponsor of Selected Shorts. Zabars.com delivers New York original toasting bagels, coffee, smoked salmon, babka, and more throughout the 50 states, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Visit them on the web at zabars.com/shorts. Additional support for this program comes from Public Radio International stations nationwide and from the PRI Program Fund. Selected Shorts is a co-production of Symphony Space and WNYC Radio in New York and is distributed nationwide by PRI, Public Radio International. Selected Shorts, Selected Shorts, Selected Shorts, Selected